at all. What's your background? So if you could just, present yourself and just say briefly what your background is, that would be great for me to sort of know who I'm speaking to.
So just say Trish Adamson, and I'm doing a PhD in, collaborative program with the Institute for Life Course in Aging, but my home faculty is Faculty of Information, UFT.
Faculty of Information? Okay. And what's your thesis on?
Not undecided. I'm still working on it.
Okay, you're working on it. Okay, thanks.
Hi, my name is Loreto Fernandez. I'm a clinical psychologist and I am doing an observership at the Princess Margaret Hospital.
Cool, thanks.
Hi, my name is Evelyn Kaczynovki. I'm a psychologist from Argentina and I work here as a counselor and I'm very interested in senior sexuality.
I'm Jill O'Donnell. I'm an elder care consultant in the private sector. My background is nursing and sociology, and I have social service administration from honors. I just have a question. Do you know Dr. Kim Lutzen in nursing ethics from Stockholm?
I don't. No, I don't. Okay. I was doing my thesis in Linköping, at Linköping University, so I just moved to Stockholm University, so my sort of main contacts in research is not actually Stockholm University, but okay.
I'm Peggy Zennett, palliative care social work and research.
Okay.
And I'm a graduate of this program in my master's. So.
Okay.
I'm Sander. I'm a senior research associate here at the Institute for Life Course in Aging.
Yes, we've met.
Yes.
Right. So, well, to be perfectly honest, I'm not sure if this title today is in some ways very much reflecting on the work I've been doing, but I'm doing empirical work, so I don't know if theoretical is really sort of right to what I'm going to speak about today. I will sort of speak about my empirical work as well as making some kind of theoretical reflections. And since we're kind of a diverse crowd, I think it's sort of difficult to go into nitty-gritty things on theory as well. So, but I just wanted to thank Susan for letting me come and present at this seminar. It's great to be here, and I have a lovely office here, so I'm really happy to be able to see you at the Alma Institute. And I also want to say that I'm open to all kinds of questions. You don't have to wait until the end. If there's something you don't understand or something you want to know more about, please feel free to sort of raise your hand and ask something. Since we're not that many, I think it's good also to have some kind of, a bit more informal conversation, not that I'm sitting here telling you all my stuff and then you're sort of allowed to raise your hand afterwards. But I'm happy to answer any kind of question. As I'm saying, I don't know specifically what you know about gender studies and feminist theory, which is my background, so I will try to sort of explain some things, but you know how things are. You tend to sort of think about that everyone knows the stuff you know sometimes, so it's difficult. As it says here, I'm at a gender studies department and I have my PhD in gender studies. And I became interested in aging and sort of life course issues is coming from sort of interest in embodiment in general. I did my sort of bachelor's thesis 10 years ago on masculinity and disability. And from that I became interested in sort of what I understood as potential discrepancies between masculinity and disability, and from there I went on to do work on aging and masculinity. And in gender studies, there has been a lot of focus on issues of intersectionality, how gender intersects with other kind of social inequalities like class, race, sexuality, etc. But from my perspective, and I think many working with feminist gerontology agree that aging in old age hasn't really been an issue in gender studies in that way. So what I'm trying to do in my work is sort of merging then gender studies with a lot of the kind of interesting things that are going on in critical, social and cultural gerontology. And those kind of fields haven't really been in dialogue very much in some senses.
I think I understand embodiment, but could you define it for me? Because I'm looking at it and thinking I really don't know what that means.
In my sense, it's the cultural and social experiences of the body rather than sort of focusing on the anatomical things. But so sort of more the perceptions of how bodies come to matter as a part of a social process rather than sort of understanding as sort of from a biological, medical kind of perspective. But that's a good question. I've never really had that though, because to me it seems like But that's a good question, yeah. And from my perspective also, like, coming from gender studies, I understand gender as something that's social and something that's performative, being done throughout the life course, rather than being, inherent in bodies. Which means then that we have different expectations on how to do a boy or a girl, or how to do a mature or an adult woman or man, and sort of the expectations of what it means to be like an older man or woman. But what's interesting to me also is that there has been sort of similar trends in social gerontology and in gender studies, that there has been a trend, and Julia Twig talks about this in an article that was published, I think, in Journal of Aging Studies 2004. She discusses how, sort of, because of the fear of essentializing, we want to focus in social gerontology on aging as being a social issue, not only as being something that emerges from the body. There has been a turn away from the body, and in similar ways there has been a turn to the social aspects of gender, rather than focusing on gender embodiment and sort of the links between the social and the sort of corporeal. So I'm interested in also sort of looking at how bodies actually matter as aging bodies and as gender bodies. And to sort of go in more into detail, so this is a bit of my background, sort of the things I've been interested in and sort of how I moved into my field. And I started out my PhD as working on men, masculinities, aging, and bodies in more general sense, but after a while I sort of felt that, let's see, what we got. So this is like, so what I'm going to talk about today is then my doctoral thesis, and like Susan was pointing to, I'm going to say a few things at the end about my new sort of recently launched project on Alzheimer's disease, sexuality and intimacy, and I'm sort of happy to get comments on like ideas or things you've been thinking about when listening to that as well. In gender studies, there has been sort of a general, like I was saying, like not very much interest into aging and old age generally. And in studies of men and masculinity, as the sort of subfields of gender studies, there hasn't really been any focus on older men. And what has interested me then is, like I was saying a bit, the discrepancies of notions of old age as linked to asexuality, as dependency and frailty, which might then be seen as sort of at odds with ideals of masculinity, at least the sort of dominant hegemonic ideals of masculinity, as strong, competent, autonomous, etc. And I think then sexuality poses this interesting field because it's, on the one hand, there is a long-standing sort of tradition or understanding of old age as sexual, that sexuality declines with old age. On the other hand, what's going on right now is also, which a lot of sort of like Stephen Cass and Barbara Marsh and others in Canadian research have pointed to a shift in terms of sexuality, pointing to sexuality as increasingly becoming something that is part of a positive and healthy part of aging. And I'm interested then in sort of how that impacts on men's own experiences. If we look at historically, if we look at how science has treated sexualities in later life, there has, like, most studies didn't really include any of the populations above maybe the age of 60 or even the age of 50. But in like recent years, there has been a few studies pointing to how sexuality is by older people understood as something that's important, more important than it was 30 years ago, and that sex is an important part of life. So there's like a re-sexualization then of later life going on, where it's understood as like something positive. But as I myself and other sort of critical and feminist scholars have pointed to, this kind of new focus on sexuality in old age or in later life has very much been focused on, it's a very sort of narrow conceptualization of sex. On the one hand, it's sort of focused on penile vaginal intercourse, and it's also very much focused on men's erections. And there is sort of clear connections there too. And Barbara Marshall, who works at Trent University in Peterborough, she's pointed to in several publications how the pharmaceutical kind of discourse, how actually the introduction of Viagra and other pharmaceuticals have changed the ideas of men's sexualities in later life. How sexuality before was understood as a natural kind of decline thing because men was naturally becoming impotent as they aged, have now been sort of challenged by the idea that you can always maintain and retain your sexuality and your erection, most importantly, by using drugs. But there are very few studies that actually then interrogate how do men themselves experience this shift. How do men sort of navigate between ideals of, on the one hand, the sexual oldie, now sort of emerging what others have been calling sexy senior, and but also these kind of long-standing negative and ageist stereotypes of the dirty old man, that men shouldn't be like sexual in certain ages in wrong ways. So the new interest in sex and aging, I think, needs to be sort of further explored, and that's what I've been trying to do in my research.
Then can I ask what later life is? What do you gauge in later life? When does that begin? What age?
I mean,
I can't wait to
good.
hear this actually.
Yeah.
When's later life? What in what you're talking about?
Well, talking about my study, the men
Yeah.
dying in my study are between the ages 67 and 87. So I mean, like everyone, or many people in aging studies still tend to refer to retirement age, and in Sweden that is 65. So that was, but I was open to, when I recruited men, I said men above the age of 60. But it probably says something about sort of how men then perceive themselves as old or older as well, because not many, like I think the oldest that I got was like 66, so no one actually perceived themselves to be sort of directed to from this study.
The other thing too, are you going to talk about the difference between the single perspective as opposed to the couple or marriage perspective on men?
I could say some. I mean, the thing is
No,
that
I'm sorry. If it comes in literature later, but as I'm sitting here, I'm thinking, because I'm at that age. But I mean, there's a huge difference when I'm seeing societally with single people, single men, as opposed to men who are married, and I think there is a difference actually.
I think that's something I could talk a bit more on, because I think that it hasn't been an explicit thing in my work, but I mean, the majority of the men who were in my study were coupled men who actually live in a relationship. And in many senses, if you look at the sort of the case, since men still live shorter life, of course, live shorter than women, many men tend to be in relationship for longer, more than women. So in one sense, but I will talk a bit about that, because I think it's a valid sort of reflection, because it also impacts on sort of the results I get. It's very much, and when I look at the men who weren't in a relationship, I can definitely see, as you're saying, that there were different ways of experience and articulating how they experience sex and sexuality, and not least like sexual desire and those kind of things, because how you talk about sexual desire when you're in a relationship is not, I think, is a sort of important thing. But thanks for the question. Yeah, I will try to sort of,
And I just had a question from the web audience, if you would kindly repeat people's questions, because they can't hear what they're saying as well as they can hear you.
Okay, yes, I will do that. So, like it says here on my slide, I'm interested in the sort of shift from a sexual old age to continuous sexual activity as a part of the healthy pocket in later life, and how that then becomes sort of narrow focus on intercourse and men's erections. And also, as a feminist researcher, I'm also interested in sort of the theoretical implications of this, that in gender studies, we talk sometimes about phallic bodies, as men's body as being phallic in terms of being conflated with their erections, but also how men's bodies are often conceptualized in Western cultures as hard, impermeable, in contrast with women's bodies as mushy and soft and sort of permeable. And I think the aging men's body is an interesting case for this, because as men's bodies change, they also become softer, and then sort of may, and as I explore in my work, also challenge these ideas of sort of phallic sexuality. But on the other hand, The strong discourses on the use of Viagra and other drugs tend to kind of re-phallicize aging male bodies. So going in a bit into my work, and telling you a bit about my study. The study is a qualitative study, so it draws on 16 interviews and 14 what I call body diaries. And the body diaries were sort of a way for me to explore also other ways of studying embodiment in aging, and it could be used in other contexts, obviously. I have not, I mean, you might know of things similar, but I have not come across something that is exactly this way. And the reason for using body diaries as well as qualitative interviews was because I thought it was interesting to see also how men narrated their embodiment and sexuality when they were sitting in front of me as a researcher. When they got the opportunity to express themselves in other kind of modes, how would they speak about sexuality? And if you're specifically interested in that method, I could talk a bit more on that later as well. The men I recruited from advertising in weekly newspaper, presentations in seniors clubs, actually, and senior social venues. And the men who part of this study could in many ways be understood as very sort of normative older men, in the sense that they were all white, they were identifying as heterosexual, and they were all relatively able-bodied. Some of them had hearing problems, and things that sort of could sometimes be identified as a disability, but most of them are identified as able-bodied. And the spread there was a pretty fair spread in terms of that there were working class and middle class men, and they lived in different areas of Sweden. And I think one of the things that often come up when I present my work is the question of sort of how can you as a young woman do this kind of study? And my response to that in some sense is that we are always somebody when we're doing a study, and I think it sort of stands out more me doing this kind of work than if an older man himself would have done it or an older woman. But on the other hand, I think that if I listen to how men speak about how they speak to other older men about sexuality, some of them say it's a lot of bragging. They say they go home and they have sex all the time, blah blah blah. So obviously the narratives change depending on who you're talking to, but it's well worth keeping in mind that they may frame things in specific ways when they talk to me in relation to somebody else. But on the other hand, I think that, well, one of the things that might be interesting to think about, for example, is the sort of stereotype of dirty old man. How do you sort of meet a younger female researcher talking about sexuality without being a dirty person? So I think that some of the results that I will talk about is also sort of shaped from this kind of meeting. But then would I have been somebody else? It would also have shaped the meeting, so it doesn't really necessarily mean that it's less valid. To say something on the sort of overall results of the study, I think that the way the men discussed their sexuality was very much in terms of that things were different but very much the same in a sense. So they perceived sex and sexuality to be continuously an important part of their later life. But still, it was different in terms of how they, in terms of attitude and what they perceived to be pleasurable and sort of significant in terms of sex. And one way of speaking about sexuality in my study was by presenting how one had become a more considerate, tender, and unselfish lover. And these are some quotes that sort of reflect these kind of attitudes on becoming a more tender and unselfish lover. Nora says, "I'm more interested in touching and feeling like that now than before." She thinks that's really nice. So he also then in this kind of quote positions himself as somebody who's actually, becoming better because she also thinks it's very nice. And Frank says, "As a sexual partner, I'm probably more considerate. I think I was in my 50s too, but in my 30s I was not considered like that. Let me see, I don't remember exactly, which is interesting also, that you might not always remember all things all the time. Between 50 and 60, I could probably say that I become more tender. All these questions. I think what is not very explicit in this quote by Frank, but which you can see in other quotes, is that when men speak about their sexualities, they very much distance from or make a difference from both younger men today, but also themselves as younger men, as being selfish, as being one-sidedly focused on sort of getting laid, sort of having intercourse, having an orgasm, whereas today they perceive things to be sort of more oriented towards pleasing their partners, but also sort of experiences their bodies in a wider kind of sense. But this is important because then they use sort of the younger man as some to want to distance from all the time to make themselves become better and more kind of mature. And Eske says, I was in bed with a woman kissing, all the time kissing. I was so taken by her lips, right? And then she said, like, kiss me down there instead, she said. That was the first time I heard something like that, really. And that was the first time I understood. What's funny is you learned one or two things. So this thing of learning is really coming back in several of the men's narratives. Maturity is not only narrative in relation to sexuality. They talk about themselves as maturing, becoming better in many senses, being more considerate towards people in general. But it's one way of framing it is in relation to sexuality. And I don't know what kind of order I should say these things in. But part of this way of talking about oneself as more considerate and tender and selfish was also related to what Nuru says in the first quote, that he was more interested in touching and feeling. So touching and feeling was in part an orientation that happened from new attitudes that they held in later life because they felt that they become more mature. But on the other hand, many of the men also pointed very much to how their bodies had changed from aging, that the aging body in itself also made some things possible and some things less possible, and that then actually shaped how they experience sex as well.
So does it become a coping mechanism?
It could be understood as a coping mechanism, but I'm sort of a bit, how do you say, like, I'm not sure if I would like to call it a coping mechanism then, because coping in a sense then meaning that it's sort of a strategy that's taken up because there's no other way of dealing with the situation. But I think in one sense the way I interpret their narratives is also then a way of actually, opening up to a new kind of horizon. So rather than just, like clinging on to what's still functioning, but maybe I'm not a psychologist, and coping is a sort of psychological concept as well. So, but in my mind, coping then is, but clinging on to what works rather than sort of opening up. And I sort of perceive when we talk about these things also to be, finding more ways rather than, just finding the only way left. So do you see the difference?
Yeah, I'm going to be quiet in just a minute, but most, it's my researcher coming on, I'm sorry. But are most of these men taking medication to get an erection?
No, very few of them do that.
Okay.
Very few.
And what I would have loved as I'm sitting here, I would have loved to have heard their partner's reaction, how they find the difference. Because I would be really, but that's me. I would be really interested to see, because they're saying touchy feeling, and I'm wondering if the women are just saying, come on. I really, I would love to have seen that comparison, in these men, because, and the difference, if it's been a long-term relationship.
It's interesting how you can sort of sometimes trace the women's voices in how men speak about them, because a lot of times I like to emphasize, because sometimes the idea of men and sexuality is that sexuality is really, really important, and like a decline in sexual function or sexual erectile function, that would be like a fate worse than death. But what I see in my studies is very contrary to that, sort of how men sort of reorientate to find very many other strategies and ways of understanding their bodies and sexualities. But still, I think it's like but what these men are, they are a lot of things at the same time, obviously, as we all are. And while they on the one hand point to the value of intimacy and touch is really, really important for how they perceive sexuality in later life, they, on the other hand, also, a lot of them still talk about how they worry about that their partners won't be pleased. So they're still very much invested in the idea that they are the doers of sex to women, that they should please women by doing specific things, and that the loss of an erection might sort of be a problem for that kind of doer identity. So they're on the one hand opening up to like sexuality becoming something more than only like coital sex. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, they're still thinking about coital sex as what women want. So, and what's interesting when you were saying like what the partner says is that you can hear when you interview the men them saying, well, my partner, she thinks it's fine, or she thinks it's like, she doesn't really care, but I still worry that she might be sort of not pleased. And that sort of ties in what I'm going to talk about here in the quote by Noor as well, because he gets prostate cancer and he gets a treatment, a hormone treatment, which has the effects, some of you may know, that you may, for example, develop breasts. So he says that it was a very special experience, this hormone treatment. One part was how it changed the body. The breasts started growing. I thought that was really embarrassing. It was a real blow to masculinity. But what's interesting in relation also to his partner is that it is in relation to his partner that he actually starts to re-experience these breasts. Because at first it's like this classic, oh, this is a loss of my masculinity, I'm not a man, this is not a male body. But he says, well, she, the wife, thinks that this is, that since I have this big belly, she thinks that if I didn't have the breast, the belly would look like bigger. So these breasts take out the difference. So she sort of means that it would go like this, so now it's more kind of smooth. So she appreciates the way it looks, he says. And I ask him, so she thinks it's sort of fitting. Yeah, so she thinks so. And also, that is a bit sexy, he says. And then I'm like, okay, oh, that's interesting. Oh, what does she mean when she's by this? Well, it's sort of soft and nice. Well, they aren't that big, he says. But does she say that she thinks it's sexy? No, but she touches them. And then I realized I've connected. So when she touches you, you can feel that this is something that she finds attractive, sort of, I ask. Yeah, soft and sensual. So there's an interesting turn in his life and also in this interview that he at first understands this as a real blow to masculinity, something that's sort of taking his possibility of sexual subjectivity away from him. But in relation to his partner then, when she sort of affirms through touching him that she finds it to be a sort of an asset in their sexual relationship, he starts to sort of reconfigure his body. And I mean, the breasts are sort of very much epitomizing how we think of female bodies. So it's really, I mean, this is like the best quote I've got, of course, because it's so sort of clear in how bodies can change and how that could still like, be part of a sexual kind of meeting. But there were also other sort of examples of how men, it wasn't just the erection. I mean, I really want to emphasize it, that when men talk about their aging bodies, like, okay, erection was one thing, but there were other things, like one man says, well, I can't stand on my knees anymore, so that makes a difference for how we sort of practice sexuality. And another man said, like, well, we're both kind of fat now, so that kind of makes things a bit different as well. So all these kind of ways of talking about bodies were ways for them to actually talk about how they reorientated to intimacy and touch, and how they sort of started to experience the body in a wider kind of sense. Feeling the entire body is something that actually men explicitly talk about. So as you can see, the sort of changes in terms of attitude and the changes in terms of bodies are sort of interlinked. On the one hand, you perceive yourself as more mature, and that orientates you to intimacy and touch. On the other hand, you also sort of become orientated to intimacy and touch from how sort of your body changes. And I mean, I'm a critical scholar, so for me, it's important also to sort of think about what these things means in terms of like a wider political thing. And on the one hand, I think it's important to be critical towards how men then construct a desirable older self. I think that by talking about yourself as more mature and talking about yourself as a more intimate, a better touching partner, that is a very sort of resourceful way to you to make sense of yourself without being regarded as asexual, but at the same time avoiding being understood as a dirty romance. You're like, this is a possibility of a good sexual subjectivity for an older man to talk about yourself in that way. On the other hand, I also want to sort of affirm the possibilities of thinking that things may actually become different, that we actually see the aging body as an asset that makes a difference for how gendered subjectivity is sort of shaped. And this, also want to sort of stress that this is not something that is like separate for older men. Vulnerabilities in men's bodies, changes from disability, illness can happen throughout the life course. It's not just in this specific case that it's relevant, but I think this sort of evokes the questions on how to actually talk about experiences of men's bodies and sexualities in ways which aren't really presented. And particularly when you think about the discourse of like the new sex is zero kind of discourse, when sex becomes part of this sort of like project of being an active, engaged, older citizen, I think it's also very important to challenge these kind of discourses, because they are very much pointed to gender bodies as well, that being this kind of active sexual man then reinforces, as I was saying earlier, like a phallic kind of sexuality. And this is not really how men experience it themselves, as you sort of, at least from my study and all different other studies, it resonates what other studies also says, although there are very few of them still. So for those of you who are sort of interested more in theoretical things also, I developed in my thesis and other publications the concept of affirmative old age, where I draw on sort of feminist embodiment theories on sort of the materiality of the gender body, but in this case the aging body, and how then the affirmative old age is a way to think about not aging as decline and decay as everything, but on the other hand not sort of buying into these kind of successful aging discourses when sort of you should be like sexy because you should try to maintain a life as you were in midlife, because as many critical scholars have pointed to, this kind of successful aging discourse very much wants to keep people from aging in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
So what time is it? So how am I doing in sort of?
It's doing good. It's 12:35. We have 25 minutes, so you can open it up or
So we got 25 more minutes before we end.
but we can end earlier if you like.
Yeah, I'm just gonna say a few things. There was a photo here, but that never happened. Oh, here it comes.
Oh, yes.
This isn't the man in my study though, but I think it's interesting, to see how men with breasts in this sense. I'm just gonna say a few things also about sexual desire, because I think that I've been saying a lot on sort of erectile function, those kind of things too. But I think that less has actually been discussed on sexual desire, and in some senses that is just as interesting, because it's sort of understood as always being there. And I think that when I talked to the men, they very much talked about sexuality in terms of sexual desire always being there. And I understand that as what sort of makes men into men, because men are perceived to always have sexual desire. But on the other hand, as I was saying at the beginning, doing masculinity is sort of also linked to the life course and aging. So saying that you have such a strong sexual desire as you used to have when you were younger isn't really sexually appropriate either. So if you look at these kind of quotes from Edward, he says like, oh, I mean, nowadays it's not like when you were young you could see a good-looking woman across the street, something like that, and you could be affected, right? Sexuality is also affected, but I think it's more about close contact now. You're not turned on by somebody on the other side of the street. And that says now is not when you were 17, 18, because then you had almost a chronic hard-on. So they point to how their sexuality is now more serene and sort of
Do you think
not
their
as strong.
expectations match their situation?
Expectations in terms of what they can
Of
get.
what they expect they should be like and what they really are like? You know, like, it's a whole assumption that intercourse is what sexuality is all about.
Mm-hmm.
When it changes as we age and it becomes more what we were talking about, the
Mhm.
touching, the feeling sort of thing. But do men have expectations that they think other men have, that they should have, rather than the reality of what's happening?
So you think they listen to other men and like hear their
and
stories
like they don't
and think,
measure up, and they, you know, there's this disconnect.
It's interesting. I mean, what comes to mind when you ask this question is, like I was
Can
talking
you
about
repeat the
earlier,
question,
a
Lynn?
man who's actually, I forgot it. Okay, whether men's expectations match up with the reality, whether sort of the pressure from other men or the outsiders sort of something they relate to. And I think, yeah, definitely it does, obviously, since I was talking about they feel that they still have to be like responsible for the erection for her sake. So definitely there is a perception that
But even
but
for their own sake is what I'm talking about, not for the woman, but for themselves. They feel that this is an important element of their sexuality. I think women's expectations are quite different.
yeah, but I think that maybe that's answered partly by how men talk about sexual desire, because in one sense I think that since they themselves understand that sexual desire is something that naturally sort of declines as you're aging, it would be like inappropriate to have such a strong sexuality as you had when you were 17, 18, as Axel is saying here, that you have like a chronic hard-on. So in one sense they feel that they match in that sense, but it's like a minimum requirement is to still have some kind of sexual desire, and that becomes very evident when you listen to the men who've gone through treatment for prostate cancer, for example, when loss of sexual desire is a part of the what do you say?
Side effect?
Side effect, that's the word, thanks. So even though that's sort of naturalized within a pathology, they still experience that it's very weird not to feel sexual desire any longer. But matching up to expectations, it's a difficult question. I'm not sure if I know how to answer it, because I think
there's a lot of element of truth as to what people say and what they think, and what they think that you want to hear.
But that's exactly. I think that's sort of an interesting part of why men emphasize intimacy and touch so much. It's both directed to me as a researcher, because they do not want to sort of emerge as too dirty, too sexual, but it's also presenting oneself in relation to more
But they still
general
want to
societal
appeal,
discourses.
they want to think that they're appealing to, that you're appealing to them, or they're appealing to you. They still have that desire.
Definitely. I still think that they still need to. What I'm going to say about sexual desire, for example, is I think that many of the men, they talk very nostalgically about the sexual life earlier, which, in my sort of perspective, then, I mean, Sarah Ahmed, a feminist theorist, talks about sort of how heterosexuality, because these are heterosexual men, how heterosexuality could be understood as a path that's been walked on through life, but also we walk on it because there's a path there. But while walking on, we also sort of reinforce that kind of path. And I think what these men, by telling their sexual stories early in life, are doing is very much that they're pointing to, like, okay, I'm here right now. I've been walking this path. I've been having all this like sexual desire. It's sort of giving me a direction. Even though I might not be as like sexual today as I used to be, I still have this background, this path behind me that has led me to this kind of point. So I think I might not still answer your question, but I still think that that's sort of says something about sort of expectations and sort of timing as well.
Were there specific questions that you asked them? Like, I'm kind of on a dark here because I don't know exactly how you did this, but were there specific questions you asked them, and what's a body diary?
Oh, let me talk about that later. Yeah.
Because like you asked that question, it's a great question.
Mm.
But what questions did you ask to get these answers?
Mm.
That's where I don't think we're quite
Like the
understanding.
disconnect.
Yeah, that's where the disconnect is, because I don't know why you got these answers. Like, what
yeah.
did you ask them? So
I started out by asking them what sexuality meant. God, I can't remember anymore because I finished this like 3 years ago, so I got disconnected what I actually asked them. But I always started out with the question of what sexuality meant and what sex meant. And then from that, this was an open, semi-structured interview. So from that, what they said, that sort of led me into other kind of questions. But I didn't always ask, for example, explicitly about sexual desire, but rather sort of picking up on that, whether that was talked about. But I asked questions such as, do you perceive yourself to be sexy? What do you perceive to be a sexual thing? So both related to how they perceive like their experiences of sexual practices, but also sort of what they understood as like sexy and sexual, and how they perceive their own bodies, kind of thing. The thing is that since this project started out in a more general interest in embodiments, I started out with interviews that related to a lot of different things, and I think that was pretty good because that meant that I didn't just start immediately, okay, tell me about your sex life, but rather sort of, I learned a lot about these men's lives, and then sex was part of that, and I think that also made it a bit like you got a biography of the person before sort of getting into sex, because obviously sex isn't distinct, or sort of it relates to all kinds of other aspects of one's life. So, but so these were some of the questions, but since they were semi-structured, there was some kind of different. But what was striking to me was that many of the men still returned to kind of the importance of intimacy and touch, although questions might have differed because I followed their sort of way of talking about sexuality. But just to conclude what I've been saying a bit. I think that embodied aging impacts on experience of gender subjectivity, as we've pointed to here, and how we can actually understand the aging body not as just as something that has a materiality in itself, that has a force that actually impacts on how you perceive your own subjectivity. In this case, like how masculinity is being perceived. And orientation to intimacy and touch as a reconfiguring sexuality as going beyond this kind of idea of coital imperative. But as I was pointed to also, intimacy and touch is also a way of shaping a desirable sexual self in later life. Part of sort of avoiding being a sexual oldie and avoiding, on the other hand, of being a dirty old man, it was a kind of a good existing sexuality. I don't know if I should say, so I was just saying that this earlier, that affirmative old age is a concept that I developed in relation to my thesis. It's a way of thinking that old age is beyond success and decline, and which actually then also takes in the aging body and the gender body as very relevant to this. And I don't know if I'm going to say very much about. I'm just interested in hearing any kind of reflections on how you think about sexuality, intimacy, and gender in Alzheimer's disease, because I think that part of my project has been sort of on able-bodied older persons. I think that very much the discourse of sexuality as desirable in later life is to do with what third agers, people who are younger, still quite fit. And I think that people with dementia are very, very little discussed when it comes to sexuality, and that people with dementia are more perceived as a problem still than that it should be like a healthy and sort of good part of aging. So I'm interested then in moving into a field where people aren't necessarily affirmed the same way these men in my study have been. But I'm also sort of interested in, and like from my perspective, I haven't really seen many studies that takes a gendered approach to dementia in general. That a lot of the studies existing point to how, and I might be wrong because I'm just new into this, so I'm happy to hear anything. But I'm interested in sort of if gender is something that is performative, that is like doing throughout life, how does that then intersect with Alzheimer's disease? A lot of the existing studies are rather sort of, pointing out that more women than men have Alzheimer's disease, and that women do a lot of care work in relation to. So that's kind of gender approach existing today. But I'm interested in sort of the intersections of Alzheimer's disease and gender and sexuality, because I think that sexuality is in itself, intimacy is an interesting sort of sphere for interrogating gender subjectivity in general. So these are sort of like a bit what I'm gonna work on in the future now in the upcoming years. We got a grant from Swedish Research Council. I'm going to work on a project now for 3 years, where I'm going to interview and do some kind of mixed methods project with people, with couples where one of the partners have been diagnosed with dementia. And so far I've only sort of done one pilot interview with a couple, so I'm very much in the startup of this project.
Are you going to do it here in Toronto?
No, I'm only here in Toronto until December. I have I got a sort of going abroad kind of grant for coming here to prepare the project, and I'm going to do the rest of the project in Sweden. So, and that's maybe something I should say as well, because it strikes me when I'm listening. I was at CAG, the gerontology conference now, and I was listening to Laura Hardy-Clark, who's working on Canadian men and masculinity. When she talks about this, she very much emphasizes, how masculinity in the traditional sense is still very important for these men. But I mean, what I've seen in my study is very much how men sort of negotiate these kind of things. And it might also be related to the kind of cultural context of my study, that in Sweden we have kind of a strong egalitarian discourse, though it may be sort of like a paper product kind of thing, because that doesn't necessarily mean at all that we're gender equal. But still, talking about oneself as more sincere, soft and stuff, is kind of, in one sense, also part of this kind of egalitarian discourse, I think. So that might also be something to note in this study. But thanks for listening. And I was meaning to bring my thesis book, because in Sweden we print the thesis into a book, so I've got a really nice copy and I was going to show it to you, but I forgot it, I'm afraid. But if anyone's interested in the actual thesis, it's online, and you can also get a copy from me if you email me. And these are some of my publications that are related to the project.
People with dementia.
Well, can I just ask, before going to dementia, just something that I think both of you brought up already. I'm just trying to understand that you did your interviews, semi-structured interviews, I assume in some private venue, right? These were not focus groups. These men were talking to you one-on-one in a comfortable environment. And you do seem, I think, rightly concerned about their self-presentation to you, and wondering how their responses might have differed had you been somebody else, but pointing out that, of course, you have to be somebody, so they have to respond in some way. But then you also alluded a couple of times to the body diaries, and I'm wondering if the people that you interviewed are the same people who completed the body diaries.
What are they?
So that was question one, if they're the same ones. And secondly, if you could elaborate a little bit more on what the body diaries included. And thirdly, whether you're able to, you seem very worried that they didn't want to appear overly sexualized or overly focused on coitus to you. I don't see a concern for that in the quotes that you've presented, certainly in what you described as the path they had taken through life. They don't seem worried to present themselves to you as fully sexual beings across the lifespan. And so that's maybe something, that you can tick off as, okay, this was good. But also I'm thinking that the body diaries give you a triangulation, if I have a correct sense of what they are. So maybe you could speak to those.
And tell what question you're answering as you say each one.
This is
Thank
to
you.
speak a bit about the body diaries and how those sort of related to the interviews, sort of.
Whether the same people answer body diaries and semi-structured interviews, how being able to answer both, look at both, gives you triangulation.
I don't know how I can say that shorter than that. Like,
maybe just repeat it for the camera.
Well, it's too long to repeat like in one sentence though, but but if there was a triangulation between the body diaries and the interviews, if people did the same thing, right? That was one thing. Both and, because some people were doing both body diaries and interviews, and some were only doing diaries, and some were only doing interviews. I think that, I mean, body diaries, they were part of like the early part of the project where I wanted to make men narrate their bodies in a general sense. So I asked men to write about their bodies, and they gave them some suggestions on themes they could write on, like eating, sleeping, going to the toilet, you know, sex, being with other people, illnesses. So I had like a couple of themes that directed them in some senses, but the way it turned out was very, very different from very different people. Some were very keen to write. They wrote like for a longer time. I said like, could you please write for at least 2 weeks? So some continued to write for a really long time, which made the material kind of difficult to handle as well, because they didn't really know how to deal with all the material. But I think that my discussions, which may not have much, like you were pointing to, most of the stuff I'm presenting here is from the interviews, because I think that it was, most of the times it was more difficult to take out stuff from the diaries to make into neat posts. But I have published stuff that is on the body diaries and as well. And if you're interested, there are sort of sections in my thesis so you can read sort of those. But I think what was important for my understanding of the significance of intimacy and touch was actually the body diaries, because they pointed to a much more kind of fluid understanding of sexuality than the interviews, which was probably because in the interviews the main way into it, the whole thing, was sex and sexuality rather than something else. But when reading the body diaries, the kind of interfaces of intimacy and sexuality and touch were very much sort of more present. Like I have one man who's also been interviewed, and so like that is very good, because in that sense you can also sort of see how he elaborates on sexuality as being something more than like coitus kind of thing. But in his body diary he writes very beautifully on how his wife is diagnosed with cancer, and how that's what happens in that kind of process. And you could sort of see that like touch, intimacy, and sexuality is sort of moving into each other in that kind of crisis experience. We don't have any quotes to share right now, but these quotes are very sort of, you know, it also sort of points to how he's very dependent on his partner, and how that sort of is both like a sexual but an intimate kind of thing. So to say something like more to the point, I think that the body diaries were interesting as ways to actually, for me, redirect my thought from sex to intimacy and to touch, and to understand how that kind of, you know, the broader kind of horizon exists. That isn't really, it might seem stupid, maybe I'm just, you know, very too much focused on sex, but and it might be very evident to everyone that like sex doesn't exist like this, that it is part of a broader kind of intimacy sphere. But I still thought it was fascinating to see these kind of, you know, ways of talking about sexuality in relation to touch and intimacy in a broader sense in the diaries. So that was something about it. But I mean, like I'm writing about it in my thesis, I felt the body diaries to be like a failure, because they didn't turn out the way I wanted them to be, because you can't control things when you do this kind of thing. So I found it that like maybe it's a positivist ghost on my, because I'm like my sort of ontological epistemology background is more kind of post-structuralist one, but when I was looking at the body diaries, I was like, but how am I supposed to compare these? What kind of knowledge is this? So I felt that it was worth like sort of exploring, but I still don't really know how to relate to them, because interviews are interviews kind of thing. You've seen those being used in other qualitative studies. You know how people take on them, but for diaries I didn't really know. But then it could have been,
there is literature on people keeping journals, so that might help you to look at the materials, to see what other people have done. The other thing I'm wondering is, did you ever get a chance to ask the men who kept the journals how they felt about keeping the journals, what their reaction was, or whether there's any material in the journals about their response to keeping
well,
the journals?
in some of the interviews, I did the interviews after they had written, so I based some of the questions on what they had written in their diaries as well. So that was a kind of, I mean, that was a good way in a sense, because that made it possible for me to go in different kind of directions that were relevant to them. But I didn't really specifically ask them whether they were like how they perceive the whole kind of process, because no, we didn't really talk about that. No. So
Very interesting.
thank you.
I can say just one thing about Alzheimer's, because I was in long-term care for a long time, so sure. I think the saddest thing for me, and the saddest things for the families, were when other relationships developed.
Yes. that's
And
what I was gonna
you would see it coming off the elevator,
Yeah.
and the husband or wife would look, and here is this new person in their life
That's right.
making out on the couch. And it was,
Away from her is a perfect example.
away from her is perfect, it's
Yeah.
just perfect. And it'd be interesting for me just and one gentleman said it so beautifully. He said, I don't care. He said, I don't care what I see when I come off the elevator, because every second I get to spend with her as a gift. So I don't care.
Wow.
Isn't that, he wasn't
Wow.
remarkable, but he was the only one who did it. Other people just,
Yeah, they
Just-
freak out.
oh,
I
what
mean,
was
this
it?
is the people who were in the long-term care
Yes.
facility
Have
developing
relationships
relationships
with other people.
with other people in care,
Yeah,
and then
exactly.
therefore,
Yeah.
Exactly, exactly.
I developed
That was
homes for cognitively impaired in the 90s.
Yeah.
And one of them was the Savory Manor. It was up at Mount Pleasant and Eglinton area. And we had a fellow named Wally and another one in Henrietta, and she was from Windsor and he was from Peterborough. And the daughter of Henrietta was from a very high class Rosedale family. And the mother had been married to a doctor, came here, they were both there together. Christmas time arrived, and I called the daughter, and she was taking Wally home because he didn't have family to go home to for Christmas. And I said, Melissa, I have to talk to you because I said, there's an issue here with your father, with Wally and your mother. I said, your mother won't go to bed anymore at night unless Wally's in bed with her. And I really did not expect it. She broke into great fits of laughter, and she said, well, Jill, they certainly can't get pregnant, and I don't think we're going to worry about venereal disease, and so if it makes them happy, I'm okay. However, 2 months later, she got a bed at Belmont, and he went berserk, and he died at Sunnybrook Health Sciences Unit, Behavioral Unit, because they missed each other so much. She went downhill very quickly.
Oh my goodness.
And I said to the daughter, don't separate them.
Because
They had a relationship.
they had love. They had love.
Yeah, exactly.
They had love.
And that, when they were taken apart, it fell apart.
That is very, yeah, that's very, very
And
interesting.
I was just gonna say, when people have dementia, their inhibitions are down,
Oh, yeah.
and people don't understand that so much, is what you're talking
Yeah,
about.
oh, for sure. Yeah, for sure. So it's the education and explaining of,
Yeah,
and hopefully the understanding of, because that's the goal. But you know, your work on diaries, I will tell you, I only do kind of interviews and stories. As soon as you said it, I said to myself, words, patterns, and categories. That's how you do. That's what you do with your material. You look at the words they use, set it into
Yeah,
pattern,
I mean,
and then you
obviously
set it
I've
into
done something
category.
with them, so definitely. But
I
I
would
still,
love to
I think
see.
it's just interesting, you know, how you sometimes, as a researcher, have a desire for control still, and things are very messy, and
Good
when,
luck.
yeah,
you
when
are
things
allowed
are very
to,
messy.
if you have diaries where there's too much, you are allowed to sample. Just so you know. You don't have to do that.
Yeah, but it's
Thank you.
great. You have some great material there with those diaries.
But you need it from graduate students now.
Exactly, that's what I need. I need more money, basically.
More money.
Thank you very much for
Thank
coming.
you.
Thank you so much for coming and all the questions. That was great. It's always very